or Mark Wunderlich, excuse me. A lot of W's going on. We have Mark Wunderlich and Diane Seuss to discuss Mark's latest collection, God of Nothingness. Um, for Diane Seuss, I Don't Want to Die is forthcoming in an anthology from What Book Press. What Falls Away is Always. Writers over 60 talk about death. And Grey Wolf Press will publish Seuss's fifth collection of poems, Frank Sonnets, in March of this year, next month. Mark Wunderlich was born in Winona, Minnesota, and grew up in rural Fountain City, Wisconsin. His work has been included in over 40 anthologies, and he has been featured on NPR's All Things Considered. Wunderlich has also taught in the graduate writing programs at Columbia University, Sarah Lawrence College, Ohio University, and our own San Francisco State University. He currently serves on the writing committee of the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown. And just so you all know, you can ask questions and comments in the Q&A feature on Zoom. Enjoy the show, everyone.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I have done a little more than that was in my bio, but most of you know or don't care about all that. So I'm going to read a few sonnets. I'm kind of the appetizer portion of the show. And these are a few sonnets from my very soon forthcoming collection, Frank Sonnets from Grey Wolf Press. And then Mark will be the main course, reading from his incredible new collection, The God of Nothingness. And we'll have some time at the end for conversation. So here I go. You know, I was torn between reading stuff that somehow connects with Mark's work or revolting against him. But I guess I'll start here with a poem from San Francisco. He called from San Francisco. I was nursing the baby. He said, I have a lesion on my calf. It looks like a cigarette burn. This was early in the plague, no cocktail. My basement apartment beset with wasps, the nest located in the bathroom fan. Then biting red ants, basement no place for a baby. Looking back, that part was small potatoes. I was nursing again when the Challenger blew up. They say the astronauts were alive until the cabin hit the water, eyes open all the way down. You'd think my milk would have been copious, but it was not, and yet I am an animal. From there, it was neuropathy in his feet. He hobbled who once won the town tennis tournament. 3 figures wearing black showed up at the end of his bed, and he went blind, thought the answer was dime store reading glasses, his mind gone. Then his body filled with ocean water, though he was from a freshwater place, river, stream, mucky inland lake, newts in the window wells. His parents were poor, but had scored a second-hand above-ground pool there behind the fruit stand. Here's a San Francisco poem too. He said it bummed him out his dick didn't work anymore. But it was never about Dick for us, was it? Though for a while it was all about Dick for him. San Francisco Dick, far, far away from his brutal fireman father and me. He could finally do what he wanted with his dick and other people's dicks and dress as I Love Lucy and write a serial featuring Dyke Van Dyke and refer to himself when not wearing dress and wig as an existential cowboy. The charismatic impresario of all we did, Alan said of him. But that wasn't how it was for us. We did not waste our charisma on each other, did not dress for each other. Or did I dress for him a little bit? Did I perform for him? I knew no other way. The last time I saw him, before he lost his mind and filled with ocean, died, he said, die, your body changed. I just given birth to a 10-pound baby, Jesus Christ. What do you want from me? What did you ever want from me? And this will be my last. Marry dull. Those who retain full access to their imaginations are cross-hatched bitches. They may look good from a certain angle, wearing a tight black slip as a skin with their furry legs dangling out the bottom and cornflower boots that originated at some defunct box store and were donated with the soles worn thin and then stolen from a St. Vincent de Paul, while a defrocked nun had her back turned fumigating bras for resale. Don't marry that. Its boots all jingle jangle. It's not going to loan out its rain hat or adopt a calf. I learned to read at age 3, used a toilet plunger to suck ants out of their holes. One doll danced, another spoke in tongues. What do you want from me? If you rotate me like a jewel, you will locate the flaw that runs all the way through like a pulsing vein of gold that brings in the fat cat colonizers who ruin everything that came before. The fish, the birds, the actual human people. Don't marry that. Go for something with half of an imagination, half or a fourth. Like Mikkel instructed about his ashes, a fourth to his mother, a fourth to me. I disobeyed, slit the phony box, and set all of him free. So that's me. And now, Mark, and I just, I want to say how much I admire The God of Nothingness. It's really one of the most glorious books of poetry I've read in years, maybe my life. So go for it, Mark.
Thank you, Diane. That's maybe the nicest thing anyone has ever said. So I have a little surprise here. So this is an advanced reader copy of Diane's book, and it is so fantastic. These sonnets are on fire. Oh, look, there it is. They can talk to each other. So I can't wait, and it's nice.
That would be weird. A new kind of narcissism.
So it's thrilling to have that. So, and what an honor for me to share this virtual room with you, Diane. So I'll look forward to our conversation as well. So I'm going to read from the book, and I'll start with the first poem in the book and read it. It's a poem of a kind of etymological poem, and it's about my last name, and which of course is here in America we pronounce it as ugly as we can, as Wunderlich, and in German it's Wunderlich, and I'll use that once in this poem, but I'll go ahead and read it. And the title of the poem is just Wunderlich. The name means odd. The name means queer. It can denote an odd fish. It suggests a queer chap. Sometimes it means capricious. It can also mean peevish. It's a synonym for singular. It is thought to be poetic. The Pied Piper of Hamelin was called Ein wunderlicher Kauz, with his colorful clothing come to pipe the rats away. He drowned them in the Weser, or so the stories go. When the mayor withheld payment, he took the children and drowned them with the rats. Or perhaps they went into the mountains, or they moved to Transylvania. It is 100 years since our children left, says the crumbling book found in the church. That is what it means to be a Wunderlich. The name means strange things happen to him. It means he can be disputatious. It means he sometimes wears peculiar garments to a party, that as he aged, he seemed younger, less reliable, more in touch with what he would call his soul. You might not call it that yourself. It can mean quarrelsome. It can mean he prefers cats. It can mean he has a gnome tattooed near the hair underneath his arm. It means he loves Christmas like a simpleton. It means makes sushi out of Spam. The name means curious, as in he bought a haunted house, and since weaning, he's not touched a woman's breast. It means he loves the color orange. It means he studied Dutch. It means pancakes for supper once again this week, and that he prefers to knit his own socks. The name means electric organ maestro. The name means famous botanical illustrator. It means the drunken tenor ass over tea kettle down a set of Viennese stairs. It is true there are few of us, that we spread ourselves thin around the globe. Find us making wine in Hungary, herding cattle in Namibia, captaining a ship somewhere off the Chilean coast. My Wunderlich steamed up the long brown Mississippi in a boat that put them and their peculiarities off in Wisconsin, where the name means a shady farm growing a crop of moss on a roof, an old man with a pistol in his pants, a child who didn't survive and occupies a pagan's ashy grave atop a limestone bluff, where the wind speaks his strange name or worse, voices recognition, an attribution, or a curse. I don't think this one needs an introduction. It's called Death of a Cat. Little beast on the metal table. She took the needle into her forepaw and didn't flinch. The medicinal death fit itself inside her, ran the blue and red map, burned up into her lungs and brain and heart, which slowed, and she slept until there was no breath left, and her body emptied itself of air. A bit of blood showed at the nose, and as her warmth left her, her lungs and throat rattled a little, which was the sound of the earth taking back the quickness it had lent her. 11 years had passed inside her body, all of them as my companion, having found her as a kitten shut up in a cage. These were the years during which I have lost a great deal, while the cat watched in her dumb way, unburdened by the need to assign language to everything she sees. A man I loved left, and the household we built together became a private realm, populated by my singularity, the paper city of my books, and by this cat who patrolled the 32 corners of the house. She occupied the place in my absence and my presence, eating and licking her paws, shedding her undercoat as winter folded back into spring, and insects and stray bats returned as fodder for her games of cruelty. She knew nothing of my nephew and the noose he slipped around his neck, leaning forward while seated on the floor, until the life was strangled from him, and he was found among his store of guns, a long knife, the tight black clothing that he wore. Outside, Portland kept winding past, with its bicycles and beer, pretty bridges spanning a river whose name I don't even know. A city image of perpetual immaturity, fixed like a young man strained against a rope. Hope didn't live there with him, in the clapboard house he shared. And for some time, it didn't live with me either. The cat didn't mind, winding behind the wood stove in the fall, when the first cold night sent me to split some kindling and warm the old stones of the hearth. She didn't care about anything other than herself. And in this, there was perfection: to eat and sleep, to find amusement in the hunt, to seek out the slant of sunlight where it warmed the clean pine floors, and to meet me when I came home in a way that resembled love. How she came running, hearing my key turn the tumblers of the lock, even though I had trained her to link the sound of my arrival with the food I would spill into her bowl. There was bliss in this, to be met by a body at the door, to be joined at night in a bed, her head within my reach, inside which no words tumbled, no reasoning wrecked the morning, no memory bound the missing to my single body left lying nightly in the bed. In the morning, I rise up and go out into the world, forgetting whatever images flickered through the dim chambers of house or brain, bed and book and hearth, the smoke rising up from the stove embers, which, in the morning chill and with my black tools, I stir back into warming life. I was going to say I'll read something cheerful, but I don't have one of those. So this one is, we'll just continue that with another animal poem. This one is called Cuthbert. And it's a poem that it's sort of in a slightly loose heroic couplets, and it was a poem I originally didn't include in the manuscript because I had written it and I thought it was too, preposterous. There's an even more preposterous ending to this poem, which is what actually happened too. I'll maybe give you that anecdote at the end. So, Cuthbert. I had a lamb and named him Cuthbert. Cuthbert was what I named my little lamb. I fed him oats and I fed him corn. I fed him on the clover flush with spring. I pet and patted Cuthbert every day, fed him on the brightest summer hay. Cuthbert, little Cuthbert, how he grew. I knew then what Cuthbert didn't know. I trained Cuthbert daily for the fair, led him with a gleaming halter in a ring. Spring drew on and dully led to summer. My little lamb was now a market wether. We took him in a trailer to the show. He bedded down in bright sawdust in his stall. I blackened Cuthbert's pretty cloven hooves. I carded Cuthbert's haunches with a comb. I oiled his black muzzle until it shone, and the day came to take him to the ring. The livestock judge opened Cuthbert's mouth, examined Cuthbert's single row of teeth. He patted hands on Cuthbert's meaty loin, moved us into a single showman's line. The judge returned, walked off, came back again, pulled us from the lineup, and then said, this market wether was the finest in his class. That night, I put Cuthbert on the block. The auctioneer sang the money from the crowd. Cuthbert stood tensely, and I was proud. A banker bid the highest for the lamb. I led him through the sawdust to his pen, fed him a laudatory meal in his pan. By morning, the stalls stood empty in a row, and we children were invited to the show of the carcasses of market lambs and hogs, of Hereford steers trained docile as a dog. The bodies stripped of hides hung on their hooks. We filed past them, casting furtive looks. The carcasses, bright surface, right white with fat, the room chilled cold enough so that the meat we grew stayed incorruptible and fresh. We exited the abattoir's cold light, and in the concrete hallway was the sight of heads struck dumb and staring by the door under plastic sheeting on the floor. To be taken to the mink farm, we were told, for every precious portion had been sold. His head looked out at nothing he could see. Cuthbert, little Cuthbert, you have nothing left for me. The truth is that he did have something left for me, as I was invited to the barbecue. Yeah, so there you go. I'll include that. Wisconsin Gothic. Speaking of Wisconsin Gothics, here's a bit of cryptozoology. And this poem is based on a series of news stories that have happened over many years, starting, I think, in the late 1920s or early 30s, where a creature was spotted in Elkhorn, Wisconsin, a wolf-like creature that would stand up on its hind legs and walk along or across a road called Bray Road, which is in Elkhorn, Wisconsin. This is a poem that imagines him, his voice. It's called The Beast of Bray Road. Whelped in a den of timothy and fur pulled from the belly of my dam, I nursed and grew on the blue milk drawn by my suckling urge. Born white, I darkened as I aged. The softer fell on my back, coarsening as I learned to hunt. With my sibling, I began to track the deer, find where the fawns were sleeping under their temporary spotted hides, as if that could conceal them from our superiority, their mothers wide-eyed and helpless to our assaults, snorting with sorrow as we cracked the fawn's soft bones, larded with greasy marrow. Years went by hunting and sleeping, rolling together in the dust of our cunning den. In winter, we mostly slept, us three, back to belly to back, our hole in the sandstone bank occluded with brush, the snow muffling and tamping down the earth, one icy star at a time. One spring we awoke in hunger, and I watched as my brother hardened into himself, went off alone, became sullen, slinking off to the pond and licking his part that was angry and red when he thought nobody saw. Mornings went by when he did not return, leaving me alone to sleep the day away. My loneliness rose like a planet. I began to follow him, practicing the softest motion of my paws, willing the birds into silence. I watched as he stepped gingerly onto the plowed springtime field, which we were instructed to avoid. I followed, but he kept driving me back, turning to snap when I got too close, then loping ahead, singing under his breath. When had he learned what music was? From our leafy kingdom in the trees, I watched as he galloped across the field where we had seen men and their reek cloud of artificiality. There, at what was called a road, he stopped, looking up at the sky's hot eye, then rose up on his hind 2 legs and walked into the world of men. I remained behind. Many seasons came and went. Our mother crumbled into an afterthought of dust. My hidden world more hidden as men forgot how to hunt. I've seen the forest thicken, the sky warm and change. Birds arrive whose calls are foreign to my ear. I do not know where my brother has gone, but I do know that he left me here to prey upon myself alone. This one is a little family poem. It's called Ha Ha Little Hunchback. Ha ha, little hunchback, look at him pretend to trip, teeth in his pocket, ring the doorbell 3 times and make the children clap. He taught me to run the bandsaw and run the chainsaw, cut a key from a blank key, how to break into a car through the window without breaking the window. He fixed slot machines and gumball machines, made mechanical decoys with pulleys and weights. Verstehst du, Bub? He'd ask, and I'd nod, but I usually didn't understand the little hunchback. At 9, I couldn't drive, so he taught me to drive. We'd cruise the corn stubble with the noses of our midget guns poked out the windows of the Jeep. His, the Black Prince, mine, Little Red Fox, blocks on the pedals so both of us could reach. We'd shoot squirrels and we'd shoot ruffed grouse, and when I shot a pheasant cock, he had the feathers made into a fancy band for a hat. Good enough for who it's for, he'd say, tapping in a crooked carpentry nail. He made his money in moonshine sugar, made his money making bad luck loans, hired a giant everyone called Tiny, then he became Tiny's home. His teeth pinched so he didn't wear them. His idea of a lady's gift was a meat slicer he knew she'd have to wash. But who wouldn't want to ponder a moon of pink bologna slipped fresh into an outstretched palm? As a child, he'd hitch his angry pony up and beat it all the way to the train to fetch the bales of tobacco and haul them to the shop. If he dawdled and was late, Grandpa Adolf would unbuckle his wooden leg and leave it napping on a chair, then beat his little hunchback with a cane. Little hunchback, never you be late again. And I think I'll just read 2 more. This next one is the last poem in the book, and it's kind of posthumous poem. It's based on a poem by C.D. Wright called Our Dust, which I have always loved ever since, when I first read it, and I wrote this poem as a homage to her. To whom it may concern. In the Polaroid in the drawer of the house the other relatives picked over, I'm the blur in the background, mop of silvery hair. The rasp of the ash pan when you empty the stove is a bit like my voice, stuck in the chimney like a nest. You won't have to know how I procrastinated, of my abiding fear of snakes, or how I gave terrible presents when I bothered to give them at all. I was told by a psychic to remember the unloved dead, and so I did, but not in a way they would like, recalling how they got ugly when they drank, or stole the loose change from the laundry when they thought nobody saw. I spent years writing my last letters, writing off the debt of a cold bed, pretending I was busy when really I was home, pinned to the couch by a cat. For money, I did many things, trapped muskrats, forged thank you notes, let men pet me while I danced. Mostly, I played the role of someone who cared, tilted in my chair and trying to appear engaged, the preoccupied uncle you weren't quite sure you liked. That's me smoking in the Winnebago, leaving the sink clean of hair. I'm there deadheading the rhubarb nobody bothers to pick, and my worthless collections, rag rugs, concrete gnomes, were most likely put out in the trash. Sometimes I lied when I was bored. I wanted you to know what I knew, though I eventually gave that up, preferring to make you laugh. This life I led was mostly private, and hours were spent sweeping bat guano from a crumbling set of stairs. Nobody knew the half of it, and nobody seemed to care. I foresaw how neglected the town cemetery became, glimpsed in a vision the rusted fence that let in the deer. They stripped the bark from the junipers that eventually came down in a storm. I was in that storm, blown out across the ice toward Arcadia. That's a town in Wisconsin and not some name for paradise. And I'll end with a poem. It's maybe similar to the last one I read. It's actually from this, it's an anthology of poets responding to the pandemic. And this one is just called A Private Life. Now that all life is private life, I am more a fiction than previously thought. It's not so bad, not so sad to join the shades and poltergeists trapped inside the TV screen. Outside, the rain makes everything green and lush this cold spring, the goldfinches ripening as we teeter into May. I think when this is done, I'll stay shut in, tending my hens, mending the threadbare life nobody will see. Just me and my mighty mop of hair silvering like a foxed mirror, reflecting this one likeness in the glass. Perhaps one day someone will pass, notice me lost in my papery dream of books, the weedy nook of the stony garden where I drown the lily beetles in a bottle of piss. Just this lived life nobody chose, but oh, what bliss to be alive on this or any springtime day, planting strawberries in the hope of a sweetening June, sun sent by some lost god to the pebbled, red-lobed fruit I hope will break open once again on my tongue. Thank you. So Diane, there you go.
Here I am. Yeah. Oh, that was fabulous. It's so good to hear you read.
Wow.
Do you think anybody's out there listening? I hope so.
Yeah.
Mark, can I ask you a question?
Yes, please do.
So in that last poem in the book, you write, "This life I led was mostly private." So I think that's one of many things we share. And I'm wondering how you sort of parse that with the openness of poetry. You know, poetry in a lot of ways isn't a private art. And so how do you contend with those two poles between privacy and exposure?
Right. Isn't that the terrible dilemma of you know, of being a poet, this desire to, you know, be be a little actress at the end of the stage, while also, you know, craving a kind of sort of living your life in books so much of the time as well, right? So I guess I think that I write poems so that I don't have to be in the room saying these things, you know, out loud. Obviously, I think I want I want to be understood. I want experience to mean something. I want the lived life to not just be a series of occasions, but to actually accumulate meaning as they go along. I write poems very often about the worst things that have happened to me. I write about them because I want to better understand them, while I also resist the idea of poetry as being therapeutic. I feel like art making is something, makes use of the therapeutic, but it's also doing something else. It's gesturing outward. It's connecting with the tradition of the art. It's trying to be expansive. And I find by mining autobiography that I find myself I surprise myself. And I'm always telling my students, like, you have to risk everything. And very often I see people getting very caught up with the idea of self-exposure as being somehow this thing that they absolutely don't want to do. And yet they're compelled to write poems. There are lots of kinds of poems one can write that don't involve necessarily one's autobiography, but it's impossible to avoid your own subjectivity when you're writing poems, because we encounter the world in these vessels, in this selfhood that we're constructing over time. So, yeah, I don't know. It's that thing, like, after this reading is over, Diane, what I will feel is mortification, right? I will have felt, this compelled to write this book, to read these poems, to structure my whole life around that activity. Having given forsworn things and given other things up and constructed this life, look at this shelf. This is all poetry on this shelf behind me. This is what we do. We kind of build this life around poetry. And then what, of course, I experience after reading it in front of people is a sense of like, oh God, what did I just do? So I don't really know what the compulsion is, but how about you? I mean, do you find yourself torn between those poles?
Yeah, it's mysterious to me. When I'm writing, I don't, even if I'm dealing with very intimate material, I don't think of it as self-exposure. I think of it as writing. And I think nowadays anyway, that's pretty much how I see it. So even if it seems like I'm spilling the beans, it's still, for want of a better word, art. It's still a made thing. And yes, I make it out of materials that appear personal, but and are high stakes, but I want more for them than that. Maybe it's archetype. Maybe it's building something bigger than, sort of what did Berryman said, the plights and grapes, of my life, because I got plenty of those. And we're a couple of creepy bastards, you and I, honey. But yeah, so I guess I don't feel exposed, even though I perform exposure.
Yeah.
I see there's some questions here. Should we turn to them?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is somebody going to ask them? Or should I? I thought somebody was going to.
I think.
I'm here.
Oh, okay.
Read the questions for you.
All right, good.
So I think a good one to start with has to do with the title. From an anonymous question, we have, I love the poem God of Nothingness, and I believe it was the first poem I read from the collection when the poems were appearing in various periodicals. Mark, when and why did you realize that that poem and that phrase, the God of Nothingness, would become the title of the collection?
I don't actually remember when, sort of where when that happened, but I do remember when I wrote that poem, and it's a poem about it's a poem about my father, about a kind of incident that happened that I wasn't a witness to. It was something that I was told about by my mother. Now he had a brain tumor and had brain cancer, and he was being his personality had started to change, and there were sort of physical things going wrong. He was kind of dragging one leg. When I saw him, after not seeing him for a couple months, I saw him and I thought he had had a stroke, and he refused to see a doctor, and he was belligerent, and it was this sort of terrible situation, and he really wouldn't see a doctor. So it came to the point where he had this accident. He was out duck hunting and he fell into the water. And it wasn't deep enough that he was totally submerged, but it was kind of up to his neck, and he was sort of mired in this cold water for a long time. We don't really know how long he was there before eventually he got hauled out. And I just heard, my mother was sort of whispering this to me because she didn't want him to overhear it. She's telling me the story on the phone, and the whole thing just seemed so fucked up. Like the whole situation was just this, like, why can't we just call an ambulance and have somebody come and get him? I mean, it was this sort of panicky desperation around this what seemed like his demise, which he was unwilling to participate in, but it was because he had a great big tumor growing in his brain. This is why he was acting this way. And it just seemed particularly cruel to me that what a terrible affliction, what a terrible thing to have. But I became caught up in this detail. I asked at one point, I was like, where was his dog? Like, where was the dog while he was mired in this, in the water? And my mother said, oh, the dog took off. It was off doing its own thing. Like, they found the dog later. And I began thinking about the dog, and then of course reversing it into God and dog and God. And I ended up coming up with the last line of what became that poem. And it just became a metaphor for loss, for death, the idea of a God of nothingness, an indifferent God, one that the thing that causes illness and sadness. And so it became the kind of central star around which a lot of the other poems constellated. And that was, once it was sort of set, once that poem was written, it became a kind of centerpiece, I think, for the book.
Wow, that is poignant. And to riff off of that a little bit, was that the project you had in mind for this one, if you had one?
So I don't really think of books of poems as projects in that way. Like I wrote one book that was a kind of project where I did research and I set out to write it and I threw it away. And what I thought of, for me, when I have worked that way, everything seemed too predetermined. And when I'm writing poems, I want them to be vehicles of discovery, as opposed to something that I'm if I wrote a poem thinking that I had something to say, it wouldn't work. If I already had a kind of intention for where I wanted the poem to go, then it's not going to be an enjoyable process for me to write it. And it's also going to tell me something I already know. I think of poems as the kind of trail that's left as you explore the thing you don't know. That it's a series of kind of questions that you're asking, and my formula is often to begin by describing something. And through description, I arrive at revelation. Things sort of reveal themselves as I begin to describe and narrate. Very often of memory, or as I'm trying to recall something or set a scene. And so, I wrote these poems. I wrote a lot of these poems in a very short period of time. In 2018, there were 8 people in my life who died, 8 people I was close to, in sort of rapid succession, and all from all different kind of points of my life, older relatives, a former student of mine who I'd become friends with. Both of my mentor teachers died during that time. And, you know, a friend of mine committed suicide. And then finally my father died. And, you know, it was this series of losses. And so I was compelled to kind of describe them, to kind of get them down before they disappeared. And so that's what I was really doing. But I wanted to make these into individual poems, like, you know, poems that I think of as kind of, you know, these individual kind of works of art, right? As opposed to a series of things that I was linking together. What I've also found is if I write poems over time, they have something to do with each other because I'm writing them over a period of time. They're speaking to each other. And so that's sort of my preferred way to work. But who knows what will happen next? You know, we never know. Maybe I will engage on some kind of strict project. I don't really see that happening per se.
Great. That question was from Jonah Colson. She also asked, how does this book differ in theme from your other books?
I had a friend say, it was interesting, in after reading this book, oh, you finally are writing about yourself. And I thought, haven't I always been writing about myself in some way? So that was a kind of interesting question. And how does it differ? I think that this book is maybe more, more unafraid to explore it's a sort of deep sadness. Maybe I think that's part of what it does. But I also think that the kind of hopefulness that's in, if there is hopefulness to be found in the book, is within the act of writing the poems. It's actually fashioning these things into trying to make literature, you know, trying to turn it into something that someone else will read and experience. You know, each of my books have, for me, they represent more kind of periods of time than I think about them thematically. And I'm going to kind of run away from that question a little bit and say that it's my job to be the bug and not the entomologist here. And so other people can think about the different themes of the book.
I love that. Let's see what else.
Can I butt in a little here?
Sure.
And ask sort of an offshoot question. We're both from rural Midwestern places. And I heard you say in another conversation that you felt when young that to be a poet, you had to leave the rural. And I wonder if you still feel that, if that's worn itself out.
It certainly has worn itself out. You know, I'm back in a rural place. You know, I've lived here in this house in upstate New York for, I guess, 18 years now. Before that, I was living in Provincetown. I lived there for about 4 years full time, which is a different kind of rural. You know, it's different to be in a resort, what's essentially a resort, which in the summer has 80,000 people there, and in the winter it has 800 people. So, you know, that's a different kind of strangeness to be in a place like that. And it turns out that I've lived most of my life really in these rural places. I did these stints in New York City, in Los Angeles, and San Francisco, but now, you know, 18 years in rural Wisconsin, followed by, you know, 4 years there in Madison, which felt like a great big city to me. And, you know, some time on the West Coast. Most of my life really has been in rural places.
Mm-hmm.
So
how about, do you feel like you had to leave the mentality behind?
Yeah, I mean, you know,
write it a lot.
Yeah,
you write about it a lot.
I definitely did. You know, I mean, it was there was nothing there. I mean, it's not that there was nothing there for me, but there was, I couldn't be, I certainly couldn't be gay there. You know, that was one of the things. It was, I felt like I needed to go and find, you know, others of my kind. I needed to, you know, I was desperate to be in a city, and but it felt to me also like a kind of exile, you know, that I wasn't just going away because I wanted to. I felt like I was going away because I had to, and you know, that was um it you know, that left a kind of scar, I think, on me for sure, you know, in how I thought of myself, and it made going home often a sort of strained and strange experience. So, but it's an old story of, you know, coming from being born in the provinces and you fall off the turnip truck in the middle of Manhattan and your life begins, you know. I mean, it's like a movie musical is like ready to happen. And so, you know, I did that. I think when I moved to New York, you know, it was 1991, and I moved into the East Village, and you know, and it was like an absolute war zone there, and you know, in that period of time in New York. And I was in love. Like, I just walked around like looking up with my mouth open, you know, for 2 years, just looking at tall buildings. It was incredible. I had the best time. But it was also, I was sort of dropped off in the middle of the AIDS crisis to the East Village. And it was also to find myself. This was another thing. I left this place that I was felt compelled to leave. And then I arrived in a place where I realized that I was disposable, right? That everyone else was also here from somewhere else. And people who were just a few years older than me were dying. And this was you know, then another kind of revelation. And any nostalgia for the, you know, the late 80s and the early 90s, should just be driven out of people, because it was a shitty time. It was just an awful, you know, period. And New York City was just, you know, parts of the city were just a ruin. And people were really, really suffering. And it was a time of, you know, incredible cultural kind of coarseness and cruelty, which we're in again now. You know, we're also in one, we find ourselves in it again. There are so many echoes between that period of the AIDS crisis and a kind of new pandemic that's happening, you know, that, and watching a portion of the population go around as if nothing was wrong. It's a, you know, so I'm seeing kind of parallels to those experiences, but you know, I loved my time in the city, and it allowed me to kind of claim that place as well. And I'm not that far away from it now where I live, so it's within striking distance. But I'm also relieved to not be living there. And I think a kind of rural existence is going to be my fate.
It looks like we have just about 4 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, we have time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions.
Okay.
From Dean Rader, we have, hi Mark, hi Diane, great reading. Mark, I know how much you and I adore Rilke. I'm wondering if there are poems or gestures in which you let the echoes or resonances of Rilke in, and also if there are poems in which he is knocking at the door, but you refuse to let him in.
Thanks, Dean, for that question. I think maybe there's, you know, there's one of the things that I love about Rilke's Duino elegies is the ways in which the kind of syntax in his poems really shifts around. And those poems are he's essentially like a late romantic poet. You know, he's this poet who his whole career, he's kind of writing these poems, mostly that are very strictly formal. And then he starts working on the Duino Elegies, where he begins to break out of that and begins to, the poems shift. They become kind of kaleidoscopic. The focus is sort of moving in and out as he's writing those poems. And I think that maybe even the last poem in the book, this poem that is kind of posthumous, I've described the voice of the Duino Elegies as almost being like a posthumous voice. It's a voice that seemed to be coming from the other side, from beyond in some way. When he was at Duino Castle, when he began writing those poems, he was, there were a lot of seances going on at the castle. So the princess, who was his friend, was a spiritualist. And so I sometimes think of that when I think of his poems as being these, having these kinds of echoes of spiritualism, of the seance in them. Maybe he was not very interested in that himself, in the occult or the supernatural. That's not really in his work. He was definitely not a believer in a sort of life beyond this life, but he did seem to believe in the idea of a kind of spirit, a world, a realm of spirit, a kind of, he calls it das offene, or the open. He's definitely writing and thinking about that a lot. I think maybe that last poem gestures toward him a little bit. So I'll leave it with that, Dean. Thanks for the question.
Great. And for our last question, we have two people just wanting to know what both of you are reading as far as poetry this year, and if you would recommend any of it.
Diane, how about you?
Let's see. Right now, actually, I'm reading a lot of philosophy that feeds my own work. I read a lot of contemporary poetry because I do, I support poets who are publishing. And so I have to think about the books in a certain way in order to find the way to describe the material that makes somebody else want to read it, because I write a lot of blurbs and that kind of thing. And I've just read some tremendous books, this God of Nothingness being one of them. Of course, I keep reading Frank O'Hara, who sort of haunted my new book and taught me some stuff about improvisational and kinetic language that I needed to learn. How about you?
There are a couple of books I've read parts of, and I'm really excited about them. They're coming out this year. A couple of Camille Guthrie is one. She has a book coming out, and Craig Morgan Teicher has a fantastic new book. I've heard big portions of that, and so I'm really excited about those that are coming. And Diane's Frank sonnets are, of course, is soon upon us, and I'm really excited for that one too. Other than that, I have been sort of I'm teaching this class on Rilke, so I've been back in that work deeply, reading it and thinking about it. And I also have been reading these marvelous collage poems by Herta Müller, who won the Nobel Prize some time ago. She also makes these poems where she cuts words out of magazines and newspapers, so they look like, a Unabomber letter or something, that are sort of pasted together, and they're really strange and marvelous. And so I recommend those. There's one that has English translations, and the others are all in German, but she makes hundreds of these, and I think they're kind of fantastic. So those are some books I'm reading and thinking about.
One thing I'll say is we're kind of reading mad right now in this time period, and sometimes it's good to be just really selective about what you read, and to also leave space for silence. And I find I need that too. So both. I'm fed by certain work, And then I have to find that place where it becomes distracting to my own, the voice that I'm developing in my own head.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Thank
Thanks,
you, and
Diane.
congratulations. It's a wonderful book.
Well, thank you. This was such a treat.
Thank you both. The reading was beautiful. You can buy God of Nothingness both in our stores and online at greenapplebooks.com. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Night.